My name's Paris. I work at Google. I am a co-chair of Contributor Experience. I see some awesome members of our SIG here already. We are doing a deep dive. The intro was yesterday, so if you missed the intro, feel free to watch the recording. I will also upload the slides to Sketch. I swear I will. I swear I will. Today is interesting because this is the first time we're doing a deep dive for this SIG, and we're doing it on something that we think is maybe P.5, almost P0, but all of us are also extremely busy with other P0 things, so we wanted to really get a lot of your advice, opinion, support, possibly ownership of this topic, which is developer guide. But first things first, I wanted to introduce some people who are key players in this, and also let you know that we want this to be as interactive as possible. This is not a regular talk. This is not us talking at you. So please feel free to give us all of your opinions at once, or once at a time, maybe. So first things first, this is Tim Pepper. He is going to be the car driver today for us for the most part. And Tim will introduce himself in a second, but he has been an amazing new contributor who has stepped in over the last 6 months and really helped us in ways that has expanded the project. So thank you, Tim. Also, Aaron Krickenberger is here. Aaron, if you want to give a wave. Aaron is the a co-chair of SIG testing. SIG testing and contributor experience work very closely together, as you can imagine, because workflow and testing, especially as it relates to the technical bits and pieces, are largely built with Aaron's crew. And then also we have George Castro over here. George has been an integral part of the community management side of the house, and next to him is Gwyn. Gwyn, if you want to wave. Both of these awesome folks have led us to what we have now, which is the new contributor guide, of which the developer guide will be a part of. So as you can see now that we're rolling out the contributor guide piece, the next piece now is the developer guide. So that's why I say this is getting to be of critical nature. Problem statement? Yeah. So you want to hit?
Just want to de-jargon for a moment. P0.5 or P1, just to say, like, this hasn't been the priority, but it's becoming the priority. So we're looking to get more going here for, and if you're new, is it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah. And
what are we talking about?
so what we're talking about, if you have laptops and things like that, feel free to follow along too. In the community repo of the Kubernetes org on GitHub, we have a couple different areas. One is called contributors. In that, you'll see an actual guide section. That's the contributor guide to what I was alluding to with Gwyn and George's work, as well as Tim, and so many other people have made some other contributions to that. All of that material that you see in there, and then there's a develop section. The develop section is actually this developer guide. The problem has been largely that as we've grown as an explosive community, we've allowed users and contributors to just take a stab at adding docs to this. And as you can see by the develop section, most of these docs haven't been updated in 4+ months. This is one of the areas of the project where people will just throw out a doc, say like cherry pick process or API conventions or what have you, where they thought that they ran into trouble. So like, hey, let's help out the community. So we have several people who are authors in this, and unfortunately there's been no real maintenance schedule. So now we've got a deal where we've got a large section of documents, but are they outdated? Should this even belong in a developer guide? Would this confuse people? How can we make sense of this information that we have in here? I mean, really, like one of the bullets, it's really just been a tragedy of the commons. So now we're really here to clean this up and really hear some opinions from you all on kind of where we should take this.
All right. So I'm going to kind of try to set the stage a little bit, just give a couple of analogies. So Kubernetes is growing, right? Like this is from the Wayback Machine a couple years ago. Like 64 people were in the org 2 years ago, and now we've got this conference with over 4,000 people. This is a massive, massive growth between then and now. So newcomers are a thing, it's happening. So I used to do kernel development, and immediately I saw this when I got involved in Kubernetes, and this is again from the Wayback Machine, like a long time ago, if you looked at kernel.org, this is what you saw. And there's a link for more information, and you go there, and this is literally the entirety of the information that you got on the Linux kernel. This is like from 1996 or something, when I was getting involved, and this is all I had to try to figure things out. And I'm thinking, I don't want Kubernetes to be that way. We gotta do something more than that. And the kernel community went through the same thing. This is my bookshelf from the span of like 15 years, the books that I built up and the iterations of the books. So when I look at Kubernetes, I look at our guide today, this is the thing, and there's just kind of this splat of information, and I want something more. Like, I don't know if it's a book or what, but when I go in and look at the docs, there's kind of some stuff, but it's not quite comprehensive yet. It doesn't really give all of the stuff that I'm thinking I need as a developer coming into the project to understand how and where to write code. And if I look at my bookshelf, it's literally this today, right, for Kubernetes? Or Kubernetes internals anyway. Like, you might say, well, there's Kubernetes up and running, but it's focused more on users and operators. As a developer, I don't have that like understanding the Kubernetes internals book, that tome. And I want that. Like, as a newcomer, this is the table of contents from understanding the Linux kernel. You've got all the major subsystems. You can just pop it open and see, and if I'm a newcomer, I've been tasked it as my job, or I'm a hobbyist, I'm interested in something, like, there's a page that I turn to, and I go do that. And I know that that's gonna sound daunting, like, oh, let's write a book. Like, who wants to write this book, or who thinks that's even possible? Well, then let's talk. But at the same time, that's gonna take a little while. Yeah, so Phil Whitrock just volunteered. But that's gonna take a while. So in the big picture, I think we're missing some architectural stuff, like just that core component list. Like, if I'm new and I've heard about CRDs, like, how do I go understand, how do I write a CRD, or where is the code associated with CRDs, or my boss told me that our CRD is broken. Like, what do I do? Where do I go? Where is this stuff? So like kind of a way to start out at the big picture, orient as a newcomer, and then tunnel down into those per component details. And compared to writing a book, I believe that stuff isn't too hard to draft at a high level. We just need volunteers. Curating it's gonna take time and effort, but maybe that becomes a part of Contribex. Every year we do a curation and we look at the Git diff compared to last time we did it, and we pull out the major things and see. I don't know, an idea. I see people nodding their heads in both directions. This is really complex. Mike Tisoli.
Okay, so like as an analogy here, the Rust project has started a Git book on the compiler internals. And so like, if you look at the compiler internals of the Rust, like Rust is a fairly complicated language to like compile, right? So like, I think that's an example of it's definitely possible to have this kind of structured, like in, the Linux kernel is obviously complicated too. So like, I think we could totally achieve that model where we have a Git book like that.
So what do people think? Would you folks want to contribute to something like that? Yeah?
That would be incredible, because it leverages a lot of help.
Yeah, we're recording, so we'll run the mic around to you.
I was actually going to suggest the Git book idea, because it leverages a lot of what we already do. I mean, what other community on the planet versions their community docs and event notifications through PRs in GitHub? It's just this one. Like, so I actually think the model where we're using Git to actually version our developer guide through the Git book, I mean, because Git books is actually, it's a fairly mature tool. I don't know if anybody's used it. So we could achieve that same sort of gutsy level internals of the Linux kernel, where you could be like, oh, well, here's a CRD, or what really is a controller manager, and what is a cloud controller manager? Is that the same thing as just anyway? So I actually think that would be useful, and then we could get contributions from everyone.
Yeah.
I want to hear from the Yeah, my team actually started a Git book on this topic. If you go to book.kubuilder.io, it doesn't cover all the things you discussed, not the PRs, but it talks about controllers versus operators, level-based versus edge-based, and how to set up some of this stuff.
And I think if we make it like easy to use that workflow when people are doing some of these internal, like big internal changes, like, you know, one of like the craziest changes to deal with as an internal like Kubernetes dev was when suddenly shared informers appeared, and like the entire process of writing a controller was like turned upside down, and suddenly we stopped being able to use all of our individual handcrafted like bespoke artisan controllers, and suddenly there was this shared informer thing, and we were using that, and like I don't know, I was like, what? Where did this come from? But like if we made it easy for people to be like, okay, you're doing a big change, at the very least, can you like drop like a couple paragraphs into the book, into the controller chapter, and like it's obvious, you just drop it right here in this part where it's like replace constructing your bespoke thing with please use shared informers, like find more information here, and then people can go and elaborate on that. But like if we make it easy for people, the original authors, to just like drop stuff in there quickly, I think that would go a long way.
I think that's kind of the grail. Like, if we get there, that's awesome. But even in the meantime, right now, we already have all sorts of, like, there's a halo of blog posting. Somebody eventually beats their head against it enough and writes the blog post. And if we discover that, then we can be like, hey, can we get that into the book?
Okay, I'll be the negative Nancy here. So I just couldn't help but look at that devel directory as like a wiki. I'm curious if anybody in this room has any experience successfully keeping a wiki organized and up to date, because I want to hear like what you did to motivate people to accomplish that. Because ultimately, I think like people will piecemeal run into problems and then just dump it in that devel directory. So there's no real organization there. So nobody really knows that there even is anything to update. So that's one piece of it. Like I think there needs to be a grand purge of whatever is in there, and somebody with a strong editorial voice has to do that.
So to answer that, since you threw it out there,
Tim and I did a first pass.
I really think this is a cultural thing in a team. So I just changed companies. I worked for VMware. I made that switch relatively recently. And when I came in, I started asking questions. I was like, so one of the questions then was like, so where's the wiki? Because this stuff is just on the wiki, right? And there wasn't a wiki. And within a week, my teammates were calling me the Wiki King. And we'd had like hundreds of edits on our wiki because every time I asked something, I was like, oh, we're going to hire somebody else really soon. And they're going to need to know this. So rather than us all asking the same questions. But that was me choosing to seed that. And now when I get asked questions, I poke people and say like, okay, that's nice that you answered me, but that ought to go on the wiki. And it takes, I think, that central person or people to say like, I want this culture, and I'm going to constantly be looking and poking people. And I don't know how much incentive, like I don't have to offer somebody a cookie to make their wiki edit, but it's being able to make the connections and ask.
So like I agree that if it's known that that's the way that we do things, that would help. We don't just have a broken window there, like the whole building has practically been demolished. So the other like concern I have is when you talk about doing an annual refresh of this, and I heard concerns about CRDs and shared informers. Remember, this project moves on a quarterly release cycle. So there's brand new information and ways of doing things on a 3-month cadence.
Yeah, ideally it's always up to date, right? But like you say, like who sees it always up to date? And I see that maybe an annual cycle is like the safety net to say like, hey, let's double check that we haven't missed anything major.
So I want to tie back to one other thing, which is I think like keeping the docs as close to the code as possible makes it more likely that they're not going to fall out of date. And one thing tell me if I'm wrong, I believe this project is atrocious at using actual doc.go files inside of each of the packages to describe what is this package? Why is it here? What does it do? How might you use it? I think this is a good example of a tool dedicated to helping people build Kubernetes constructs and resources, and the documentation for how and why you might want to do that is also here. So I like the idea of sort of the narrative lexicon of idioms being here, but I still think that the actual, like, what is this component and why is it here stuff needs to live directly next to the code.
Yeah. So on that note, while the mic is shuffling around, one of the things that we talked about earlier in the day was we said, well, could this just be a sub-project list? And there is one, but today it's YAML. And somehow, if we're able to get out of that, then could whatever the web pagey thing is then refer off to be sort of like some overarching detail, but then refer off into details that are out in the code. And then hopefully the next thing that would come from that is automation to notice, hey, that thing that we're referring to has had a PR. Does the thing above it in the docs area need some adjusting as well?
Okay, this sort of makes my point irrelevant. So we can move on if you want to talk about this.
No, these are just some things. I think we've already kind of hit on these. And those are just in case nobody talked. The goal is that we just have a conversation.
So I just wanted to make a comment about the wiki thing. Hold on. So yeah, I was just wondering about your concern about the wiki. So like one big difference I've noticed between using a wiki for documentation and using something like GitHub is the fact that there's like an owner and review process. Like wiki is really cool because like anyone can edit it and they can just drop stuff in there. So then it does kind of end up being a big sort of like mess and like conglomeration of stuff. But I think if there's an owner and there's a process where like the owners have to review it, then it kind of stops that from happening. The other thing is I'm just curious about the process, like when people add new features, is there any kind of requirement that they have to add documentation? Because I think that would make a big difference as well. It's like your bundle contribution includes like your tests, your thing you're doing, and then the docs as well.
I think there's multiple people like going out. So one thing I would say there, I really feel like this is part of a SIG lead's role. And I think it's something that the contributor experience SIG can try to advocate for, but at some point you have to have your leaders choosing to lead in this way.
I just want to answer the questions, that's all. Okay, so first to go to the new features thing, right? If you propose a feature, you need to have a design proposal for what is this, why am I doing it this way, what's the prior art I'm considered, what is this explicitly not supposed to solve? What we historically as a project have been poor at doing is turning those design proposals of great ideas into something that follows the life cycle of the implementation of that feature. So now we have this thing called KEP, which I forget if it's required or not, but it's supposed to try and give these things an explicit life cycle. And so we could use KEPs to mandate that like documentation of the architecture and design and motivations of a feature should follow it and should be in an easily discoverable place. So if you look at the code base and see that, oh, this is the Frobnozer and it was implemented via KEP 007, you can go look at KEP 007 to find the design docs and all of that stuff. As far as the Devel guide having an owner, it is still effectively a wiki because there doesn't seem to be a clear explicit owner. And I think part of what I wanted to see out of this session is, much like the contributor's guide is a sub-project of contributor experience, it has an owner's file and the owners are right over here, and I showed them on my slides at a talk yesterday. The Devel guide doesn't really seem to have that same explicit set of owners. So I kind of want there to be a developer guide sub-project that contributor experience owns and is staffed by somebody who is sufficiently motivated to have that editorial voice and make that decision. But that's the question, who is sufficiently motivated? Usually the people who get really cranky about it being out of date are cranky about it being out of date for their problem. Or they'll be willing to point out like all of the areas that they couldn't find their answers, but they're not willing to actually go in and dig through and say, well, these were the 10 places I didn't find my answer. Here's the one place I found it. So I'll go fix it at the one place I found it, but I'm going to forget about purging all the 10 incorrect places, right? There does need to be some real dedicated effort to it. I think this is the right group to own it. I'm just not sure we have the staff for it, that's all. But that's totally what an owner's file is for. Last thing real quick is, this seems to be a problem that SIG Docs faces with the documentation of their stuff that's more user-facing all the time, where what they do is they have two kind of groups of reviewers. So they use the doc writers to make sure, is it like a well-written thing? Is it in English? Is it grammatically correct? Does it make sense? But they need a technical reviewer to go through and say, yes, this is catching all the right details and mentioning all the correct corner cases and is technically correct, the best kind of correct. We don't have anybody like that who has the sufficient breadth of knowledge to speak to everything in the devel directory right now.
I mean, just to say, like, that's where we are. I mean, that's why we haven't gotten this done in 6 months. I mean, everybody complains about it, but yet no one necessarily offers to help or own it. I mean, welcome to open source.
Well, one of the things, so that link up at the top is the umbrella issue on GitHub for like doing something about this. And one of the things that we're hoping to leave here with, and the raising of the hands, like it was in response to the harder problem of who wants to write the book, but like, who wants to be a part of fixing this? Can we leave here today with like a people who are saying like, I'll do some part of the solution?
So correct me, someone can correct me if I'm
Anybody?
wrong, but I was under the impression that KEPs currently were not required, or the documentation seems to imply that KEPs are not required for major internal refactors, just for external refactors. Like it says, if this is a user-facing thing that we might want to expose to the community, do a KEP. And so that kind of leaves the implication is that leaves the like major internal refactors not necessarily tracked under a KEP, which like I understand kind of why that is, but it also means we don't have a similar way to track such a refactor or track the requirements of like a requirement like you must add devel docs when you make an internal refactor, similarly to you must add user-facing docs when you make an external refactor.
It's true that KEPs aren't required. I guess I'm just trying to point to that as a model for cultural change.
Yeah,
It's,
the KEP is a part of it, and it's a nice, I think, because it's a top level one. The SIG leads are going to be approving that KEP to go through, right? And if as a part of that, they're saying, oh wait, where's the docs? They get used to saying, oh wait, where's the docs?
Yeah. So like I could argue that some of your questions about like what are the architectural principles of Kubernetes and why were things designed this way should at this point be relatively set in stone and spelled out in a document called architecture somewhere and should be reviewed by SIG architecture. And I feel like somewhere along the path of a feature graduating through alpha to beta to stable, documents that cover all of that should be passed through SIG architecture. And we should have a relatively decent core subset of Kubernetes that can be documented to that book format today, right? Like I do think a book can be written on some of that stuff, but as for the implementation of the rest of Kubernetes that's moving and that we all have questions about, that's a significantly tougher thing. I kind of feel like KubeBuilder or something like it that's close to the code might help us address that a little bit more. But things like API conventions or what's the best dev build test cycle and stuff, like that's a pretty bespoke thing for a lot of developers. Like each person kind of has their own way of doing that. That's convenient to like which cloud providers they get for free and things like that. I just use GKE for my stuff. Are you kidding me? Like, so I don't know. I feel like there are kind of multiple problems here. I'm just trying to understand how we could like delegate some of this to other SIGs. Again, I think that's something that works well for SIG docs. Is they're like, we have to have the docs, we have to have this, but we also cannot possibly have the expertise necessary to vet all of this material.
So is that a hypothetical, or is there like where would current architecture stuff be?
There's a directory with some of that stuff. There is a directory with like API conventions and some architecture stuff, and most of it's kind of up to it's scattered around devel.
You're talking about somewhere in devel, okay.
And half of it's kind of up to date almost, and some of it has thoughts from people that are not clearly distinguished from like things that are set in stone versus things that you should do. And if you've been on the project long enough, you can kind of pick those two apart. And I would not want to be someone who had not been on the project long enough to pick those two apart. Yeah.
But I actually think it can be an entry point for somebody who's a little bit newer. You may not understand it, you may not be able to pick between the two, but it can be like, if it's confusing and you can have a bit of a sense of the SIGs who should know the answer, you can go and say, hey, I'm trying to improve the devel guide. Can you point me at some people on the SIG who could help explain this? And you learn more, but you contribute that learning back into the doc.
Hi. Oh, hey. So when I was new, I would have very much appreciated really just a shorthand. I feel like we're getting a little bit sidetracked in terms of, oh my gosh, what about all these different nooks of the code and how are we going to keep docs on them? Really, what I want as a newcomer, and what I now want to help newcomers onboard, what is currently still missing from my become a contributor spiel, is how do I set up my dev environment and get started? I really just want that. I really just want one thing that works, and it's kind of like it's not that it's just kind of not there. It's like broken up, and it's mine, Aaron. It's my speaking stone. And basically, I think just having the starting level be there, from that point, people would have just so much more knowledge and also confidence to go and ask in the more, far-flung areas of our code base. Now I'm done.
Yeah, just real quick. So we talk about this every Wednesday. I'd love to hear from the rest of you before it just becomes me and Aaron arguing all day.
So actually, we have an example of this that we just merged into the kubeadm repo on Monday. We didn't have any way to teach people how to do the very simple things that are necessary in order to build and run kubeadm. Like, how do you verify your changes? Like, how do you feel out the new developer experience and the user experience for a kubeadm binary where you're making changes to the code base? And the answers are simple, but they were just never, they were nowhere. And so I pushed up a repo into my own GitHub, with a vagrant and a README with 10 lines of code in it. And then I shared it on the call, and a bunch of people, even some long-term contributors, were like, "Whoa, I want to go look at that. What are you doing?" I don't even test the stuff. I just push it up into the thing, and then people LGTM, right? Yeah. Well, I mean,
What's your name and your GitHub handle?
well, we merged it to the Kubernetes kubeadm repo because everybody liked it. So because it was just a missing thing, and yeah, there were new members who were joining the SIG. In particular, Matt Kelly from Containership was my major alpha tester on that. But yeah, you wanna?
So going back to the fact that everybody's super busy, and I don't know if anyone's tried just getting a lot of surveys or contributor feedback, and I don't know, just finding out what would be impactful to focus our energies on, or everyone's energies on.
That was one of the, so pause there for a second if I can interrupt. It was one of the things that we're hoping to get out of this. So again, that top link up there is our umbrella issue, and there's a copy paste of somebody's experience report. That's only a small portion of it. They went into here are all the weird things that confused me, and here's what would have been a structure that would have made more sense. Each of you in the audience, if you have some experiences like that, please dump them in this issue.
Even right now.
Yeah, and anybody watching the video in the
Yes,
future,
video.
do the same.
No, and to your specific question, Contributor Experience is actually going to run a survey in June. And on the last, I think, meeting that we had, notes, I started a doc that's a questions bank. So if anybody in here has questions like that, feel free to add, and then we can get that kind of information flowing.
The other thing is, I don't know if this is possible, but maybe if there's a way we can understand what people are searching for on the docs. I don't think you can track the analytics from GitHub searches or anything, but especially if you throw all these markdown files onto some HTML generator or something, you can maybe track what the searches are. I know that other... Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily want it, but and I'm not a part of but you guys, you folks may want to know what to spend your time on, because it's pretty daunting just fixing all the docs, you know. And then you can even add what's really pertinent to SIG docs, and they can take over or something. I don't know.
I just want to ask more about like what the specific problem we're trying to solve, or what the target is, because I can imagine some users coming and they want to just learn about, like, I want to learn and build Kubernetes, right? And then some folks are like, oh, I want to build networking or something like that. And the direction of the project is we're trying to minimize what's going into the main core. And so if we're directing people out to other sub-projects that aren't in the main core, is that still meeting our goals, or do we need something different than that?
Yeah, so to sort of tie some of this together, I do think the like dev, build, test cycle would be the highest impact, giving people like, this is a way that definitely works. But I don't know, some people like to use Minikube, some people like to use Docker locally, some people spin up a VM, some people use their own cloud that they get for free. Everybody seems to have like different ways of doing it, but I think if a group of people wanted to get together and make a concerted effort at putting together just a clone Kubernetes, change a thing, add a test to make sure that thing works, here's how you build it, here's how you test it locally, that would go a long way towards the beginning contributor that Gwyn is talking about. But I'm trying to understand what the scope of the developer guide is as a whole, more to Phil's point, because I feel like when this discussion first started months back, there were questions about things like API conventions, design conventions, accepted implementation patterns for different things. Like if you want to try solving a problem, which sub-project is the best place to try solving that problem? Or like, what's the pattern you should follow? Those seem to be sort of higher level, more architectural concerns, which sounds like there's demand for that. I don't know, but at a bare minimum, dev, test, build is what I think of when I think of developer. There's just all these other like convention-y, architectural, idiom-y documents that other people seem to be asking for. I'm wondering if you could break it up into multiple components to start out the work is the thing.
Beyond that, like I think that's a good first chunk of stuff, but beyond that, I think the next question is, well, what is the individual trying to do dev on? And that's where you end up with the component list.
That's a wrap with time. So clearly there are opinions here with a capital O, and we want those opinions to go on that issue link. Seriously, this is the only way we're going to get started. I feel like we've been starting this for 6 months now. So please put, there's actually, where's the one GitHub, the gentleman that wrote the very long comment? There was someone that wrote a very long comment that everybody should read too. Yeah, that. I mean, this is really cool. I think this is a good skeleton for us to start. Lee, if we could use your help with the dev environment piece, that would be crucial. So yeah, no, thanks everybody for coming, and I hope to see you on the issue.
Yeah, and expect to see us kind of trying to swarm on this over the next while. We don't know what's realistic depending on how much we bite off. Like if it's the 500-page book, it's obviously taking longer, but getting some improvements done in the near term.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in contributing to that, join us on Slack and Contribex in our Zoom meetings in Contribex, and let's make this better.
And if you're really good at Hugo and front-end stuff, we could really use your help to make something beautiful. Yeah, I'm getting a commercial.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.